大家好，我係 Leo Sir，歡迎嚟到英國嘅9點鐘，我哋又嚟到第45集啦。今集就唔係我講啦，今集我哋邀請到我哋嘅補習社嘅學術總監 Academic Director Matthew。Good morning, Matthew. You right?
Good morning, Leo. Very well, thank you. Hope you are too.
Not too bad, yeah. 今集我哋就唔係我講嘅原因係因為我哋講英國文學比較深啦，咁就唔係我能夠應付到嘅，咁所以我就揾咗阿 Matthew Sir 嚟同我哋講嘅。Matthew, whenever you're ready.
Okay, good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. My name's Matthew Hollands, and I'm the Academic Director of Leo Tuition. And I'm here today to talk about Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4 English literature. So in an English school, that's what students are taught between the ages of 11 and 16. Now, the first thing that's important to mention when I'm talking about Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4 English literature is that it actually changes from school to school. Key Stage 3 is always Year 7 and Year 8 students, so that's 11 and 12-year-olds. And Key Stage 4 is always Year 10 and Year 11, so that's 14, 15, 16-year-olds. The problem year, as such, is Year 9 in the middle. Some schools will include this as part of Key Stage 3, the last year of Key Stage 3, and some schools will make this the first year of Key Stage 4, depending on when the school wants to start preparing the students for the GCSE course. Okay, now let's start at the beginning. Let's start at the beginning and focus on Key Stage 3 English literature. So
are we talking about what is English literature at the moment?
Very much so.
Yeah,
what is English literature?
Yeah.
Now, Key Stage 3 literature for most students is about exploring as many new texts as possible. And from a teacher's perspective, it's about encouraging a love of literature and reading in the student, getting the student into those good habits of reading and writing at that young age and helping them work towards and start preparing for their GCSE exams. Year 7 tends to be about reading, researching and presenting on a range of topics. For example, this could be about life in Shakespeare in England, all the way to who is your favorite Harry Potter character and why. When students are looking at texts in Year 7 and Year 8, this very much tends to be looking at an extract from a text, looking at a few pages here, a few pages there, or for example, looking at a summary of an entire work. So for example, they wouldn't read a whole Shakespeare play. They might read 1 or 2 pages together. They might act some of it out. They might watch the animated version. They might read a summary of it. And they might prepare a project on what life would be like in Shakespearean times, which would be fun and interesting for them then, but also a few years later on, that would be useful for GCSE English literature, because at GCSE English literature, students are expected to talk about the context, the social context, the historical context of the texts that they are studying. So what I'm saying is that when a student does a project about life in Shakespearean times in Year 7, some of that same information that they research can be useful to use 3-4 years later when they're writing GCSE English literature essays.
Good. And then the next question will be, so why do we have to study literature? Why don't English language only?
Now, I've got a little bit more to say on the Key Stage 3 literature.
Oh, okay. Yeah, carry on.
That's all right. But I promise I'll move on to why study English literature soon.
That's right. I'll go back to the previous question then.
Perfect. So things to think about, okay, with Key Stage 3 English literature is the main technique that students start learning in Year 7 is called point evidence explanation. Okay, now different schools call it different things. Some call it point evidence explanation. Some call it point quotation analysis. Some schools call it point evidence explanation link, and several other acronyms. Fundamentally, this is all the same technique. Making a point about a text, giving some evidence to support that point in the form of a quotation, and then explaining, or in later years, analyzing the evidence that you've used. So for example, in Year 7, this is quite often character-based. You might read an extract and be asked, oh, what's your impressions of this character? find some quotations that show how this character is behaving or how you feel about them, up to the end of year 9, where you might be looking at different elements of a text, such as how is the theme of love shown in this extract, or how is a sense of drama and tension created. So it gets gradually harder and harder. So ideally, by the end of year 9, this is the point evidence explanation, or the point evidence analysis technique, will have been kind of solidified by the students. And so when they start the GCSE course in year 10, as is the case in most schools, they can focus very much on content-based material. Now, things to think about as well, okay, in Key Stage 3 is that in terms of the actual content being studied, is that schools will tend to base units or modules around particular authors, such as Shakespeare, or around particular themes or ideas, such as Black literature, literature from other cultures, or dystopia. There is a big focus in UK schools at the moment on literature from other cultures, in part due to the Black Lives Matter movement and literature that might be female focused, but in part due to the Me Too movement or literature from authors of LGBTQ+. Because of these issues, these themes, these ideas going on, a lot of schools have removed older text from their Key Stage 3 curriculum, which can make Key Stage 4 a little bit more challenging because students will not have studied other texts of that age. So, for example, in year 7 or year 8, you could be doing Maya Angelou's poetry from the kind of the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and then suddenly have to go to Key Stage 4 and do a Shakespeare play. So it can be quite challenging. At Key Stage 3, English is not normally split between language and literature work. Most lessons will have elements of both in them. Students will also normally have weekly library lessons, sometimes to read freely, and sometimes with some kind of research element or focus. Okay, that's the introduction to Key Stage 3 completed, Leo.
Yeah, thank you. So we have finished the introduction to Key Stage 3. We are moving on to introduction to Key Stage 4 then.
Perfect. So what happens now at Key Stage 4, whether the school decides to start this in year 9 or year 10, the literature will become focused on the text that the students will be studying for GCSE. Normally, this is a novel, a modern drama play, a Shakespeare play, and a selection of poetry that is usually focused on a particular theme, for example, love or conflict or relationships. Now, in England, there are 5 main examination boards that students could be studying. Cambridge IGCSE, so Cambridge International GCSE, Edexcel International GCSE are the international ones. So if you are familiar with international schools in Hong Kong, China, and so on, quite often those would be the GCSEs that students take there. But quite a lot of English independent schools also take those exams. AQA, OCR, and WJEC are the normal GCSE exam boards in England. In my experience, in over 10 years in the independent school sector, the Cambridge IGCSE, Edexcel IGCSE, and AQA are the exam boards most often studied by students at independent or private schools. Now, all of those exam boards that I've listed are fundamentally similar in what they ask students to do. It's always analysing 4 different forms of literature. In this case, modern drama, Shakespeare, poetry, and prose, so novels. However, there are significant differences between them, and I will talk about those briefly. Students will read and discuss these texts over the 2-year period of year 10 and year 11. They will practice writing essays on part of the text, known as extracts, and on the text as a whole. Sometimes they will practice comparing parts of the texts. Sometimes they will practice writing essays about texts they have not studied, called unseens, and sometimes they will combine both. They will learn about the historical context of some texts and also think about how different audiences might respond to them. For example, they might study a Shakespeare play, and included in the essays they're writing, they would have to think about how a Shakespearean audience might respond to the play, and they might think about how a modern audience might respond to the play. And if you think back to what I was saying about year 7 English, if they've done a bit of research into life in Shakespearean times, they might already have an idea about how a Shakespearean audience might react. For example, being a lot more superstitious than a modern audience, or being a lot more religious than a modern audience. Now, in terms of the different GCSE boards, my personal favourite is Cambridge IGCSE. Okay, it's definitely, I would say, the easiest of those 5 GCSEs I've mentioned, because firstly, students do not need much prior knowledge, and all of their essay questions are based on extracts from the texts that are printed in their exam booklet. This means a bright student who is good at analysis could achieve an excellent mark just by knowing a little about the general story and context, as well as having good analytical skills. The other 2 exam boards, Edexcel and AQA, are much harder because students are expected to memorize key quotations from some of or all of their exam texts. And in some situations, students will need to memorize 3, 4, 5 poems off by heart. So unfortunately in England, this makes English literature GCSE into a little bit of a memory exercise as well as an analytical one. English literature GCSE with Edexcel and AQA is also made harder by the students having to write essays based on the whole text, analyze the text in terms of the theme, or even compare poems they have studied or a poem they have studied with a poem that they have not studied. So Cambridge IGCSE is 4 essays, all on extracts from the text, everything there. The other 2, you're being asked to compare things, you're being asked to look at unseens, things that you haven't studied previously, much harder. Now, one thing I would always think about when students are choosing a school to go to is actually selecting a school based on which exam boards they have for English, and actually go for the school that offers Cambridge IGCSE English. But I'm a little bit biased as an English teacher. Now, Leo, if we'd like to go on to the next slide, please.
Yes, the next one will be, I know that you have prepared a slide to talk about some possible barriers for the students.
Okay, so firstly, it's important to mention that all students in the UK are expected to take both English language and English literature GCSE exams. In certain cases, schools will allow a student to drop the English literature, but I would never recommend that, because for universities and for employers, they would regard English literature GCSE as the same importance as English language and maths in the 3 most important GCSEs that any university or employer is looking for. Now, the possible barriers for students moving to the UK to study. In all honesty, English literature GCSE is one of the harder GCSEs for native English students, and the challenges are even greater if a student is not a native speaker. Some schools will suggest a foreign student only takes English language GCSE, but I would always suggest a student takes both, as most universities and jobs will not look favourably on a candidate with only 1 English GCSE. Firstly, a student needs to have a good level of English to be able to read and understand their GCSE texts. This will be made harder by the fact that some of the texts will be written in English that might be 100 or 200 years old and contain many words that are not in common usage today. So, for example, a student could move to England from abroad and have essentially fluent English, but still struggle because their GCSE texts are written in Old English, 200 years old, which contains lots of words that we don't use now. This becomes particularly relevant for the novel. For example, students could be studying a novel by Charles Dickens or Jane Austen, and the poetry, which could contain a mixture of modern and older poems. Students will study these texts closely in school, but it is suggested that they prepare beforehand so that they understand as much as their English fellow students in advance. That's before we come to Shakespeare. For many students, including myself when I was that age, studying the work of William Shakespeare is like learning a whole new language. His plays will need to be almost completely translated from Shakespearean English, 16th century English, to modern English. A lot of time will be spent on Shakespeare, as understandably most students struggle with this, even if they have been exposed to elements of Shakespeare earlier in their school life. For example, as I mentioned in Year 7, looking at a summary of Shakespeare or watching the animated tales or doing a presentation. And then maybe in Year 9, students will study part of a Shakespeare play, and then suddenly in Year 10 and Year 11, they are expected to study a whole Shakespeare play and understand everything about it, which is quite a big ask. Even more challenging is understanding the culture and context of some of the texts that the students study. They will be expected to comment on the historical and social context of their drama texts and prose. Research and discussion will be required. For example, most English students might know that people in Elizabethan times, when Shakespeare was writing, were more superstitious than we are now, but students from abroad might not know this. Most English students would know that everyone in Elizabethan times was either Catholic or Protestant and were believers who went to church regularly because they have studied the Tudors, this historical period, in history. So what I'm saying is quite often students who've been to English schools in history, in English earlier on, okay, will have learnt historical information, social context, and so on that will be linked to their GCSE studies. So there are some quite big gaps that students will need to work on. Audience reaction is another area that can make things very complicated, as most students would know that a Shakespearean audience would be scared of the witches in Macbeth because they were superstitious, whereas a modern audience would perhaps find them quite funny. A Shakespearean audience might object to the idea of Lady Macbeth being a powerful woman because they lived in a male-dominated patriarchal society, but a modern audience would appreciate the idea of a strong and powerful woman because our society is currently in a place where strong and powerful women are highly regarded. Things to think about as well when we're studying in an English school, okay, and we're studying English literature. Something I feel I should mention is that the England at the moment, I would say, is described as a very woke country. What I mean by woke is that when it comes to certain issues such as racial justice, the truth, awareness, social media, England at the moment is in the grip of a I suppose a social movement, as it were, that places certain restrictions and certain focuses on how we act, how we behave, how we teach. So to simplify matters, what I will say is that in a lot of English schools, all the way up to GCSE, certain areas will be taught in detail that might not have previously been the case. So as I was briefly mentioning earlier about students being taught literature from other cultures, and especially Black literature, this is coming through now into GCSE, which is great, but also sometimes does limit or focus what is being taught, and that can be quite challenging for students coming to English schools, because they will go into an alien environment, a new school that might have particular agendas or focuses that they might find quite unusual or strange. For example, English schools at the moment are teaching and focusing and discussing and to an extent promoting lots of material from LGBTQ plus authors. And this has caused quite a lot of controversy, even in schools such as Eton College, who recently had an English teacher removed because he wanted to discuss these matters further with his students. I mention this because quite often when in schools you are studying texts, it might be quite strange for a student in Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4, whereas previously been the case that you might study Jane Austen, Charles Dickens, etc. A lot of exam boards are now moving towards studying much more of a varied and diverse range of texts because of this agenda. So instead of where previously might be the case where you would be studying Charles Dickens or Jane Austen, you might now be studying the poetry of Maya Angelou. You might be studying, let's say, an Indian novel from the 1950s or 60s, which is, in my opinion, is great to actually have that kind of cultural diversity, but can be difficult to kind of comprehend at first, because traditionally in England we have always focused on English literature. And what I'm trying to say is that English literature GCSE is definitely no longer completely English literature, as it were. It is kind of world literature. Now, Just one last little bit on this, Leo. Yep, on to the next one. That's great.
Yes, how to prepare, yeah.
All of these things need to be considered before we mention the main area of GCSE English literature, analysis of language, looking at an author's choice of words and what the effect is that those words have. This is challenging enough for native speakers when it comes to poetry and Shakespeare in particular, and is something that English taught students are gradually built on year by year from age 11 or younger. If you remember what I mentioned about the point evidence analysis technique started in year 7 and just gradually building it up year by year. Those English students who have taken 9+ or 11+ examinations will have learned these skills at that young age. The effects of language can be particularly challenging for foreign students, as they might not grasp what the effects of a metaphor or a simile are, even if they can recognize it within a text. Being able to notice the simile through the use of like or as, but not necessarily kind of to consider and realize what that effect is, and that's something that is fundamentally requires a lot of practice. Techniques such as alliteration, where a sound or a letter is repeated, become even more challenging, as English students will intuitively know this can be either soothing or threatening, but this might not be the case for foreign students. Like everything else, this requires extensive and repetitive practice in order to become secure. There's several different types of GCSE examinations and their requirements. Some require students to learn large parts of the text off by heart so that they can analyze it. This comes with its own problems and issues for all students, as not all schools or teachers communicate the requirements of a course effectively. And even if students are at different schools, are studying the same texts, they may be from different exam boards and be examined differently. So quite often we have the case where one student might say to another student at a different school, oh, we're both studying Macbeth, that's great, but not realize that they're studying Macbeth for different exam boards, are being taught it in different ways, and are expected to analyze different things. So a secure knowledge of the exam board and its requirements is of the greatest importance. There is a lot to consider for any student who wants to take GCSE English literature after arriving in the UK, and a lot to prepare. A lot of expert help will be needed to bring a student up to a similar level to an English educated student, unlike other subjects where a student may prepare on their own, because a lot of subjects are content based. English literature is both content based and skill based, and the skills take years to master. To prepare for it, they can read the likely examination texts. Okay, these are normally available on the exam board website or the website of the school, and there are certain texts that are used year on year. For example, the Shakespeare play Macbeth I've mentioned, the Shakespeare play Romeo and Juliet. They can watch film versions of their exam texts or play versions. They can create vocabulary booklets, make sure they build up their appropriate vocabulary, particularly Shakespearean language. They can also practice their language analysis with any appropriate literature text. Okay, and on to the next slide, please, Leo.
Thank you.
So I've mentioned quite a lot of the pitfalls, the problems, the issues, the things that need to be focused on when a student comes to England. And one of the solutions we have to rectify these issues, these problems, is our courses. Fundamentally, we offer both Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4 literature courses, which will support students on what they are studying at British schools in Key Stage 3, or fill some of the gaps for what they may have missed. At Key Stage 3 level, we will introduce them to a variety of English texts from Shakespeare all the way to the present day through looking at stories, extracts, and other forms of media. We begin to look at the basic point, evidence, explanation approach, which will be the basis for their GCSE English literature essays. These sessions are fun and exciting and will help build a love for English literature and learning in your child. Moving on to our Key Stage 4 courses. They are tailored to your child's exam board and text. We design our courses and we train our tutors to be adaptable. If we have prior knowledge of your child's exam board and text, then we will make sure that they are used as examples and our questions will be based on them. If you do not know this yet for your child, as they have not started or chosen a UK school yet, then the course will focus on texts that will be most likely to come up in the exams. All exams have elements of novels, Shakespeare, modern drama, poetry, and unseening. All our tutors have experience of teaching and marking GCSE literature from across the examination boards, and some of them, such as myself, have also been markers and assessors, meaning we know exactly how to gain students extra marks and help them to maximize their marks. These sessions are completely exam focused and structured to challenge your child and help them to improve and maximize their marks.
Thank you so much, Matthew.
Absolute pleasure, Leo. And,
Thank you. I'll see you later then. Thank you.
Thank you and goodbye.
Bye-bye.